Karoline Leavitt, a young conservative voice, was invited to the Morning Current, a political talk show known for its sharp debates. She expected a regular debate with host Paul Danning, but didn't anticipate the explosive confrontation that would follow. Paul Danning, a veteran journalist with a reputation for aggressive interviewing, began the segment by questioning Karoline about media bias. Karoline defended conservative outlets and listed examples where mainstream media had misrepresented stories. The debate turned tense when Paul accused conservatives of pushing a fake narrative of victimhood and claimed they were silencing everyone else. Karoline remained composed but demanded clarification when Paul referred to people like you in his criticism. Paul further escalated the argument, suggesting that conservatives contribute nothing to society and were playing the victim. Karoline responded by calmly questioning his wording, asking if he truly meant that conservatives don't contribute to society. The interview turned into a viral moment as Paul's words were taken out of context and spread across social media, with backlash growing quickly. Karoline responded strategically, retweeting the clip with just a thinking face emoji, letting the public debate the situation. As public outrage mounted, sponsors began suspending their partnerships with the Morning Current. NBS News executives convened to decide whether to defend Paul or cut ties with him to protect the network's reputation. After an internal review, NBS News announced Paul's indefinite suspension while they assessed the incident. Public pressure continued to build, with Karoline's retweet amplifying the moment even further. When asked if Paul should be fired, Karoline responded carefully, suggesting that people in positions of influence should be held accountable. This statement added fuel to the fire, increasing pressure on NBS News to take action. NBS News announced that Paul Danning was no longer affiliated with the network. This decision caused a media frenzy, with some seeing it as justified, while others felt it was an overreaction. The firing sparked a national conversation about the role of media, cancel culture, and accountability. Paul Danning broke his silence, claiming he was fired for speaking the truth, and warning about the dangers of media conformity. Following the firing, media outlets and social platforms exploded with divided opinions. Some praised NBS News for holding Paul accountable, believing the network had done the right thing by making a stand against divisive rhetoric. Others saw it as a clear example of cancel culture, arguing that Paul's outburst was just part of a larger trend of silencing opposing viewpoints. Paul, now out of a job, made a public statement condemning the decision to fire him. He expressed regret over his comments, but stood firm on his broader critique of media bias, calling the firing an example of corporate censorship. His supporters rallied behind him, with some even starting petitions to reinstate him. Karoline's retweet of Paul's moment turned her into a polarizing figure herself. Some praised her for handling the situation with grace and sticking to her principles, while others accused her of using the controversy for self-promotion. Despite the criticism, her visibility and influence skyrocketed. NBS News executives faced immense pressure from both sides: the public, who demanded consequences for Paul, and the advertisers, who feared a backlash. The network's leadership was forced to implement new guidelines for handling interviews, specifically concerning controversial topics and personalities. The incident began to ripple through the broader political and cultural landscape. It sparked a series of similar confrontations on other shows, with interviews becoming more contentious. Political figures, media analysts, and influencers debated the fine line between free speech and accountability, shaping the conversation around media ethics and responsibility. Months later, the fallout from the Paul Danning interview and his firing remained a touchstone for discussions about media influence. It had become part of a larger narrative about the state of political discourse, leading to more conversations about who controls the media and whether individuals could still speak freely without fear of professional consequences. As Karoline's profile grew, so did the scrutiny on her. She was invited to more shows and became a frequent guest on conservative platforms, where she capitalized on her newfound fame. However, her association with the viral interview left her facing increased criticism from both sides of the political spectrum. Conservative supporters hailed her as a brave defender of free speech, while others accused her of exploiting the situation for personal gain. Liberals viewed her with suspicion, accusing her of advancing a narrative of victimhood and trying to capitalize on Paul Danning's downfall. Her increasing media presence made her a key player in the ongoing debate about conservative voices in media. The Paul Danning incident also led to greater scrutiny of how political debates were conducted on major networks. Other talk shows began implementing more rigid formats to avoid similar confrontations, with some hosts adopting a more passive or diplomatic style to avoid alienating guests. Conservative leaders rallied behind Paul, criticizing his firing as an attack on free speech. Some even argued that the left-leaning media was weaponizing cancel culture to silence conservative voices. Liberal figures defended the network's decision, saying it was crucial for media outlets to hold personalities accountable for inflammatory rhetoric that could incite division. Behind the scenes, the decision to fire Paul Danning took a toll on the leadership at NBS News. Executives found themselves grappling with the long-term effects of the incident, as their actions were viewed through the lens of both corporate responsibility and political leanings. Some felt the network had been too hasty in its decision to suspend Paul and feared it would alienate viewers who were sympathetic to his stance. Others worried about the network's public image and its future in an increasingly polarized media landscape. As a result of the public pressure and the ongoing debates sparked by the incident, many media outlets began re-examining their approach to interviews and controversial figures. Some started implementing stronger editorial controls over their shows, ensuring that debates remained civil and that confrontational moments were carefully moderated. A new focus on accountability emerged across both traditional and digital media, with public figures and hosts being held more responsible for their words and actions, particularly in politically charged environments. With her public profile still growing, Karoline began to consider her future beyond just media appearances. She expressed interest in running for office, using her platform to position herself as a voice for conservative values. Her political aspirations further fueled the divide, as critics argued that her media presence was a stepping stone for her personal political gain, while supporters saw her as a rising star in the conservative movement. Liberal commentators, on the other hand, maintained that his firing was justified, and that his rhetoric had crossed a line that should not be tolerated in modern discourse. His return to media was met with mixed reactions. Supporters lauded his resilience and his commitment to challenging the prevailing media narrative, while critics saw it as an attempt to exploit his firing for personal gain and attention. Paul also launched a podcast, where he invited controversial guests and fostered debates on sensitive topics. The podcast quickly gained traction, cementing his place as a prominent voice in conservative media. Karoline's rise in conservative media didn't go unnoticed by political elites. Her growing influence made her a potential candidate for political office. As she began speaking at conservative rallies and attending events, her image as a future political leader became increasingly apparent. Critics, however, began to question her sincerity, accusing her of using the media spotlight to further her career ambitions rather than genuinely championing conservative causes. The firing of Paul Danning sparked broader discussions on free speech and accountability in media. Across the political spectrum, individuals began questioning where the line should be drawn between free expression and harmful rhetoric. Some viewed the incident as a harbinger of the increasing polarization in American media, where free speech was often perceived through the lens of political affiliation. Think tanks, political analysts, and advocacy groups began hosting forums and debates on the implications of cancel culture, media bias, and the role of journalists in holding public figures accountable. NBS News, in the wake of Paul Danning's firing, had to navigate a precarious path. Their decision to suspend Paul and ultimately part ways with him had caused long-lasting damage to their relationship with certain segments of their audience. Advertisers and sponsors became more cautious about associating with a network that had been embroiled in such a controversial incident. Internally, the network's leadership worked to rebrand itself as an impartial news source. They introduced new editorial guidelines to ensure their shows remained balanced and non-confrontational, but critics from both sides accused them of kowtowing to corporate interests. The fallout from the interview became a political tool, used by both sides to score points. Conservative pundits regularly invoked the incident to criticize what they saw as a left-wing conspiracy to silence opposing viewpoints. Liberal pundits pointed to the incident as proof that conservative rhetoric had become dangerous and needed to be checked. This political weaponization of the event meant that the story would remain relevant long after the firing itself, as it was continually used to reinforce partisan ideologies. Let's continue to build the next steps by expanding on Karoline and Paul's ongoing journeys and the larger impact on the media landscape. Here's how the narrative can evolve. As both Karoline and Paul continued to rise in prominence, the tension between them grew, particularly as they became two distinct symbols of opposing political ideologies. Karoline maintained a relatively diplomatic stance, emphasizing the need for constructive political discourse, while still defending the concept of free speech. However, she continued to capitalize on her newfound fame, appearing at rallies and speaking engagements, where her views aligned with a more conservative agenda. Paul, on the other hand, adopted a more combative approach, using his media platforms to directly challenge Karoline's political positioning, accusing her of using the controversy for self-serving purposes. This led to several public confrontations on social media and during televised interviews. As the media spotlight intensified, both figures began to realize the potential for their rivalry to further define the political and media landscape, cementing their roles as key voices in a broader ideological battle. In the aftermath of the Danning controversy, new media outlets and independent voices began to gain traction, fueled by the increasing dissatisfaction with traditional networks like NBS News. Open arms, offering him new opportunities to amplify his voice and challenge the mainstream media's narrative. These platforms provided a space for Paul to speak more freely, where his views could resonate with a large audience. Disillusioned by the perceived bias in traditional media, his podcast and video appearances began to gather significant traction, becoming a central hub for debates about free speech and the role of the media in shaping political discourse. Meanwhile, Karoline also capitalized on the shifting media landscape by expanding her presence on digital platforms. Her measured, diplomatic approach was appealing to a segment of the conservative base that wanted to counterbalance the more combative rhetoric often seen in the media. She began to garner attention from rising media outlets, focused on presenting a more unfiltered version of political debates while still maintaining an air of professionalism and moderation. The rise of these alternative voices signified a broader trend: the decentralization of media influence. With traditional networks like NBS News losing their grip on public opinion, new media outlets offered a more direct and unfiltered approach to political discourse, leaving the public to choose where they stood in an increasingly fractured media environment. The ability for individuals to create their own platforms allowed for diverse political voices to find audiences outside the confines of mainstream media. This shift challenged the traditional gatekeepers of information and empowered a new generation of media influencers who could operate outside the pressures of corporate sponsorships and established editorial norms. As Karoline and Paul gained more visibility through alternative media channels, social media became an even more critical tool in shaping public perception. Karoline leveraged her social media presence to engage directly with her growing base. Posting videos, tweets, and statements that showcased her political positions and bolstered her image as a leader of the conservative movement. Her tweets, often focusing on free speech, media bias, and accountability, became viral moments, drawing in more supporters and critics alike. Paul, ever the provocateur, used his platforms to challenge mainstream narratives, share his views on cancel culture, and build a community of like-minded individuals. His online following grew rapidly, with many embracing his messages of resistance to media orthodoxy and his critiques of political correctness. Both Karoline and Paul saw how the power of social media allowed them to bypass traditional news outlets and connect directly with their supporters. However, their posts also sparked intense debates, with each one facing backlash from opposing sides. Social media, once seen as a way to foster connection and dialogue, became increasingly polarized, further entrenching the political divide. As Karoline and Paul's influence continued to grow, their media presence became increasingly strategic. The battle between their ideologies and public personas intensified, as both sides used the media as a powerful tool to further their political agendas and solidify their respective bases. Karoline's camp focused on promoting her as a rational and reasonable conservative, seeking to steer the party away from the ideological excesses that had alienated many moderate voters. She made strategic appearances on talk shows and interviews, emphasizing her commitment to free speech, civil discourse, and pragmatic governance. Her media strategy often involved confronting Paul's more inflammatory rhetoric, positioning herself as the voice of reason and sanity in an increasingly polarized environment. Media outlets aligned with her approach portrayed her as a bridge between the traditional conservative establishment and the more populist elements of the right. On the other side, Paul and his supporters capitalized on the growing populist sentiment, framing his combative style as a necessary counterpoint to what they viewed as the complacency of establishment conservatives. His media strategy was to call out figures like Karoline for their moderation, accusing them of being part of the old guard that had failed to push back against the left. He used his media presence to stoke outrage, tapping into the frustrations of his followers, who felt marginalized by the political establishment. Through podcasts, viral social media posts, and heated appearances on conservative platforms, Paul positioned himself as the true voice of the conservative base, calling for a revolution against the elites. As both Karoline and Paul's media battles escalated, they each became symbols of larger ideological movements. Karoline's rhetoric was often framed as a more civilized version of conservatism, while Paul's combative stance appealed to those who craved a more direct, unapologetic response to what they perceived as the progressive. As both Karoline and Paul's media battles escalated, they each became symbols of larger ideological movements. Karoline's rhetoric was often framed as a more civilized version of conservatism, while Paul's combative stance appealed to those who craved a more direct, unapologetic response to what they perceived as the progressive agenda dominating the political landscape. This growing division solidified their roles as key figures in the broader cultural and political wars, ensuring their prominence as both icons and lightning rods in the evolving media-driven battle for the future of conservatism. The stakes continued to rise, with the media becoming an increasingly powerful battleground in shaping the narrative of American politics.